From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The Biden administration plans to issue an executive order sometime next week that might restrict U.S. investment in China in high-tech sectors, according to multiple sources telling U.S. media, including Bloomberg. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computing will be targeted in a bid to curb China's progress in critical technologies, according to these sources. It comes as Australia and the U.S. have just discussed ways to deepen their military alliance in the Indo-Pacific at the 33rd Australia-U.S. ministerial consultations last month. Meanwhile, China has just lifted anti-dumping and countervailing duties on imported Australian barley, a sign of warming relations. So, what to make of all these events? Are we seeing diverging interests between U.S. and Australia, an alliance that has been rock solid dating back all the way to the World War days? And how seriously will these bans and restrictions, if implemented, impact China's high-tech sectors? To discuss all this, I'm very pleased to be joined today from Wuhan, China by Wang Peng, Research Fellow of the Institute of State Governance at Huazhong University of Science and Technology. From Darwin, Australia, we have Daryl Guppy, Independent Economic and Political Analyst. And also in Beijing, China, we have Edgar Perez, Global Technology and Finance Keynote Speaker and Author. Welcome, gentlemen, to The Hub on CGTN. First of all, Edgar, let me turn to you. According to Washington and U.S. media, the goal of this executive order, if implemented and announced, would be to, quote-unquote, prevent U.S. capital and expertise from accelerating the development of technologies that would support China's military modernization and threaten U.S. national security. Do you think this executive order, this is what it is all about?
Indeed, when you think about the scope of the order, of course, we talk initially about three basic technologies: artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computing. As you said, the goal eventually is to suppress some activity from companies to support the military in China. So I wouldn't be surprised if moving forward, the scope of these technologies will increase to any other type of new technology that potentially can also support the military, such as neuromorphic computing, biotech, and other technologies that could potentially be subscribed in the future.
Professor Wang Peng, what do you make of this? Is it all about national security?
Yes, I think that's the logic of security has overwhelmed the logic of economics. But we know that in the U.S., people say the American business is business. Business is business. So what will the reaction make from the American business circle? Let's wait and see, I think.
Daryl, what do you think?
Yes, the United States is...
Daryl, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah,
yes,
what do you make of this,
this
piece of ban potentially, coming from the White House?
I'm sorry, I'll repeat yourself. I missed that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, the United States is really shooting itself in the foot, and we're seeing the industry going to push back because these bans delay development, not just in the security sector, but across the broad development of artificial intelligence and other areas that are necessary for the development of the digital economy worldwide.
All right, Edgar, let's go to some specifics. According to sources, this executive order on banning U.S. investments in Chinese high-tech sectors is to target, quote-unquote, U.S. private equity, venture capital, and joint venture investments in China in, of course, semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. Most investment captured by the order will require that the government of the U.S., of course, be notified about these investments. Some transactions will be prohibited, according to these sources. So it looks like that this might not be a cross-the-board ban, but rather these bans will be reviewed on a case-by-case, even sector-by-sector basis. Is that your sense too?
Indeed, as I said, the scope is very limited to three initial industries. However, the goal eventually is to think about the potential support of these companies to the military apparatus here in China. So this extent of industries might change. Now, to be honest with you, when you think about implementation of executive orders, one thing is the letter of the order, and another thing is going to be the implementation. This executive order, it's going to go through a period of comment, which might change some of the details of the implementation. Some of these in transactions restrictions will be notified to the government, meaning that some of them will be approved, some of them might not be approved. So overall, I see in China a thriving AI sector, and I don't expect that to be significantly changed by the implementation of this executive order.
All right, Professor Wang Peng, what do you think? How do you see this ban, if announced, being implemented by the White House?
This implement will certainly increase the costs of both Chinese companies and the U.S. companies, I mean, their business partners. But I think for the long run, will this executive order really to stop or to make the true obstacle for China's economic and technology development? I think that's questionable.
Why are you still optimistic that the Chinese high-tech sector can develop independent of these White House restrictions?
Because for the past 70 years, it is not new. I mean, all things like these constraints, not only from the U.S., but also from, for some decades, from Soviet Union and from others. But Chinese people, Chinese scientists, technology workers, they can find their own way. And so we have changed a lot. And you know, the global business order have been changed.
All right, we'll talk about that later. Daryl, a former U.S. Commerce Department official, said this, and I quote, "This executive order, if implemented, will fill the gap in their current regime. We have prohibitions on exporting the technology. We have restrictions on inbound investment, and now this will help to plug that gap on funding, the know-how, and give the U.S. government visibility into these capital flow." Is this outright protectionism?
Of course it's outright protectionism, but it's more than that. America realizes that China is well ahead in a whole range of computing fields, starting with AI and the rest of quantum computer development. So what the objective is not just to protect American industry, but to prevent China's future development. And we have to take that into account when we're assessing these executive decisions. The idea that they apply just in a limited area at the moment is not correct. They can be easily expanded to include new areas as China's advances continue.
Right. Recently, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who is considered a dovish figure within the Biden administration, came to Beijing and potentially discussed Biden's pending executive order with the Chinese side during his visit to Beijing. Yellen described these restrictions as, quote unquote, highly targeted and clearly directed narrowly at a few sectors where we have specific national security concerns. Do you buy that, Edgar? Edgar, sorry,
in my view,
Beijing.
I think so. If you look at the scope of the restrictions, they are definitely very, very focused. That being said, as I said, these can be changed in the future because obviously technology is evolving so fast. Probably 2-3 years ago, we didn't think about artificial intelligence as the field that is really driving the technology transformation in the world. However, we now know that it's a very important field. Equally, in 5 years, we'll talk about the development of quantum computers, which is a field indeed that China and the US are competing head to head. So there are going to be potentially new fields in the future that might be included in potentially addendums to this executive order.
Wang Peng, what do you think? When Janet Yellen told policymakers and senior officials in Beijing, what would have been their reactions towards this piece of restriction?
Yes, I have noticed Yellen's comments on the executive order. For me, I think her words seem a little bit over-optimistic. I think that executive order, yes, really matters, and it is truly harmful. Some may say, hey, it's just the executive order rather than law passed by the Congress. Yes, so it can only stay with Biden administration. And if Biden loses his power in the next year, U.S. presidential election 2024, that order will be repealed, maybe repealed by the Republican successor. Yes, I agree. But in my view, it should be noticed that first, that executive order will undoubtedly enhance the currently severe political trend, negative legal system, and deteriorating public opinion environment of U.S.-China relations in nearly every aspect. And secondly, given a new president in the next year, So who? According to the latest poll, we know that is that Mr.
Trump
Donald
is
Trump.
polling
So
very
will
well
he?
as we speak.
Yes. So I think that's very strange. So that's why I hold a generally pessimistic attitude toward Yellen's words.
Yeah, let's talk broadly about America's strategy towards China. And in the past year or so, there has been this concept propagated by Washington of de-risking from China and Chinese assets and China-related economic activities. What do you think of this de-risking strategy, Edgar? Who do you think is driving this strategy? We know that there's such a thing as the deep state in Washington. Biden expressed goodwill when they first seek the seat of the Oval Office during the campaigns. They said he will improve relations with Beijing, but he couldn't, obviously.
Well, when you think about the relationship, the U.S. and China, we need to think that the U.S. at the moment is still the world's power, economic and financial and military power in the world. So from that point, the U.S. will want to maintain that. That being said, China is growing fast. China is definitely the second economy, an $18 trillion economy out there that is really chasing through those steps. So from that standpoint, I think the American public is a little nervous. So when you think about all these different measures, we have to look at the electoral calendar. We talked about the elections coming next year. So many of the candidates and also the current administration will want to look tough as elections will be coming. So that is going to drive some of the initial intentions of these executive orders, which, as mentioned before, it's not a law. It's an executive order that can be revocated later on by the future administration, for example. So if you think about something more permanent, we will talk about a law. But for that, you need to get agreement between both Democrats and Republicans. And that's a difficult thing to achieve in an electoral year.
Daryl, what do you think of Washington's de-risking strategy towards China?
The de-risking strategy is an extension of its anti-China strategy. And as we move into the election year, the anti-China strategy wins votes. Biden knows this. Trump certainly knows it. And we've got a population that has been subjected to a sentiment that's been built up by the media, by Trump and the military hawks for 5 years plus. So changes are going to be very slow. Yes, this is an executive order. That means it can be changed, it can be increased, it can become more exaggerated at the whim of the president without the need for legislative agreement. So I would suspect we're going to see an increase in anti-China sentiment going into the next election period.
Yeah, this has been the case in 2012, in 2016, and 2020. As far back as we remember in the past decade, it's always been like this during a heated campaign season. Candidates picked on Russia, they picked on China, and they picked on America's rivals, perceived or real. Professor Wang Peng, let me turn to you. Talking about this potential ban and this impact on China, of course, we know that China's AI sector is targeted. We have a problem with chips, what we call the bottleneck technologies that Beijing is trying very hard to improve upon. Where does all this come into play when it comes to China's independent high-tech sector? What potential impact do you think it will have? And you earlier said that regardless of these impacts, the Chinese businesses and the tech sector will not just survive, but thrive.
Yes. So just now, we have talked about de-risking. And for China, for your question, I think we may talk about another term, that's de-dependent. That's so for the last many decades, yes, China has joined to the global business and the global technology network that is established and maintained by the US. And we have grown up. But now the US say, hey, you are so strong and you are so strong that I feel threat from you, that you are I just want you make some trousers, make t-shirt for us, don't touch the high technology. However, China will not forever do that thing. So China's development of the technology and the economy will not be stopped by that. So in this phase of history, we say China have to make its decision to decrease its dependence on the outside technology or some, we call it supply, or we call it communication or any other words. anyway, that China must make the true decision that to make big investment and to promote its own the system of the technological development and its industrialization. And this decision is very hard to debate because everyone we have the reason of softness. Yeah, we think we call it 舒服区. Yes, certainly people rely on that. So in this phase, perhaps some forces or some attack from outside may help China's decision makers, help China's the business, the factors, and the scientists to make this tough decision and choose another course.
Yeah, if the China-US trade war starting in 2017, 2018 has taught us anything, that is China will retaliate. Edgar, what kind of retaliation do you expect from China if the White House announces such technological bans again?
Well, there might be some restrictions in the sales of some American companies, as it was the case last year with Micron. However, I think the focus for China should be actually in support of the development of these technologies in-house too. Remember, it was the Sputnik launch of the satellite, the Soviet Union satellite in the 50s, that really surpassed, the probabilistic of the development in technology in the US in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's what China is experiencing today. When you have these restrictions, now you realize that these technologies are really important. These technologies are really driving economic development. So AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, those technologies eventually will be surpassed in China as well. China will find a way to go through these restrictions and eventually to create an in-house, to build a supply chain locally that will be the driver of the development of the technology and later of the economy of the country.
Yeah, Daryl, let me turn to you. In an interview with the New York Times, John Neufer, president of the Semiconductor Industry Association of America, stated the following. He said, China is the world's largest market for semiconductors, and our companies simply need to do business there to continue to grow, innovate, and stay ahead of global competitors. So my question is the U.S. shooting itself in the foot? Of course, obviously, you answered that question, yes. But do you expect a pushback from America's own big tech companies and AI companies and chips companies? Some of them, of course, are funded by the U.S. government. They might be less inclined to criticize Washington, but others, they really depend on the Chinese market.
They very much depend not just on the Chinese market, but a global market. One of the dangers that we're facing at the moment is that we have this split in technology, so that solutions that apply in China will not be able to apply in the American situation. So we lose half of our markets in that sense. The Americans are certainly concerned with this in terms of their production. That's not necessarily to say the government's concerned. So yes, I do see industry pushback to be able to expand those markets, to be able to provide software systems, AI solutions that are globally acceptable, developed on global standards. And of course, the more that we cut off this sharing that characterized, let's call it globalization pre-COVID, then the greater the pressure is on China to de-risk by developing its own solutions to these problems. It's not going to stop. That's the important thing to recognize. Just because the US are taking certain action, it will not stop the march towards development that China is undertaking, that America is undertaking. It is more efficient if they work together rather than be separated artificially by trade sanctions and political decisions.
Yeah, of course, we have seen this tit for tat for the past 5-6 years. Professor Wang Peng, according to Bloomberg, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo plans to visit China later this month. If the executive order is signed as expected next week, what good will this visit bring? I mean, what will be the expected outcome? Is Raimondo still going to visit China, or will Beijing still receive her?
I think whether Beijing will receive her, I cannot make that decision. But I must say that if that executive order is signed as expected, and her visit to China, I think the benefits for both China and US and US-China bilateral ties will be very limited. As I remember, Professor Yan Shitong from Tsinghua University has once generated a theory called the superficial friendship theory to describe and explain why the fluctuation between China and US relations.
Superficial friendship theory.
yes,
What does that mean?
superficial friendship. Yes, superficial friendship. That means China and the US during the past 4 decades, yes, actually we have many differences in many aspects, the political ideology, institution, and so on. But for many considerations, sometimes we prefer to pretend to be our friends. But all these words, all these beautifully decorated words, will raise the expectation of others. And then, for example, I say we are very good friends. Yes, you have better, higher expectation for my next conduct. However, for those disputes or that construct, such as Taiwan Strait and South China Sea and so on, for all these real problems that I cannot meet all your requirements, so you may agree with me, and that's the same for me. So this, and when we use this theory to observe the thing, that's the sign of the executive order, that shows we have true problem. But however, we cannot solve this problem immediately. But American, and not only for this one, but for the last several months, we have witnessed many American diplomats, high-ranking officials. They come to China. They have talked with the counterpart in China, and some they say talk with the news media express, say we have very good talk. We have sincerely and honestly, but the true problem still has not been changed or solved.
They don't give much interviews. They don't give many interviews. We tried very hard on getting Secretary of State, former Secretary of State John Kerry, but we couldn't, obviously. Daryl, let me turn to you. This is really your forte. China-Australia relations. There are signs they'll be warming in relations between Beijing and Canberra. China lifted tariffs on Australian barley imports just last Friday. And here's how the Australian side responded. I want you to listen to that first.
This is the right outcome. The right outcome for Australian producers and the right outcome for Chinese consumers.
I welcome the development this afternoon that our barley growers and our exporters will now be able to re-enter tariff-free the Chinese market. It's another very positive step in the full resumption of normal trade between Australia and China.
So, Mr. Guppy, to what extent is the trade disputes between China and Australia winding down, or is this just a flash in the pan?
Don't you just love that diplomatic language? It's such a contrast to what we had to put up with for the last 4 or 5 years. So it means that we're moving towards an end of this dispute, but it's not going to be the same as it was before the dispute started. The policy on both sides is to diversify supply options. So that's going to happen. But this bent towards diplomacy with Minister Wang and Minister Farrell means we're less likely to see a repeat of those aggravating circumstances that led to this frosty environment. However, that being said, this can still be undermined by ill-considered action around defence and foreign policy. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not yet a conclusion.
Of course, we still have Chinese restrictions on exports of Australian beef, cotton, and seafood. What do you think would they take to normalize trade relations between these two countries?
Well, I think we have to recognise that some of these restrictions are for different purposes. Now, with beef, for instance, some of the suppliers who have been sanctioned have not complied with China customs import regulations around the labelling of the product. That's an administrative issue. And certainly diplomacy allows those administrative issues to be addressed more easily. In other areas, it will be a continuation of diplomacy and the quiet discussions that will normalise relations. That's what characterises the important change in the relationship between Australia and China at the moment.
Right. Professor Wang Peng, whether Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will visit China in 2023 remains uncertain, but the odds look favourable. For example, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has confirmed that Canberra, quote-unquote, would look to make sure that a visit can occur What do both sides seek to achieve there, and what factors might derail a visit?
The most fundamental goal that both China and Australia, in my view, should seek to achieve that is probably to explore, build, practice, and maintain a long-term mechanism which can separate the mutual beneficial bilateral ties, including the trade, the mutual investment, and so on. Separate this from the China-Australia, the disputes in political ideology, political institution, and their attitude toward some key issues such as human rights and so on. This first, separate this, and secondly, this mechanism, it has to separate or immune the China-Australia bilateral ties from the intervention or the control, the shadow from the third party. I think this is the most critically important thing for China and Australia for their possible visit.
Yeah, Daryl, how do you think the Biden administration might react to a notable improvement of relations between China and Australia?
Look, the Biden administration and its military agents want Australia as a garrison base for any future action that they decide to take against China. The US is the most significant agency of foreign influence on the formulation of Australian government policy, particularly in the military and security areas. And history has shown that the US will do what it believes is necessary to keep Australia in step with US foreign policy. Are they happy with the way Australia-China relationship is developing at the moment? They're not too concerned because an improvement is marginal, but they will become very concerned if it's seen that there's an impact on the US perception of what should apply in a military and security area. Trade is a safe area at this point in time.
Edgar, how do you look at the three-way dynamics between China, Australia, and America? China has long been Australia's major destination of export. Think about mineral resources, iron ore back in the day, and also the destination for Australian beef and wines. But the Australians and Americans, they're staunch allies. Their soldiers fought and died together ever since the Second World War. What do you make of the new trends in China, Australia, U.S. relations?
When you think about the executive order coming up, for example, you can think that initially it's going to stay in the States. But you can see that other countries, including Australia, will eventually might follow these instructions also of members of the administration to follow up on these purposes. Obviously, if we talk about barley, if we talk about wine, I don't think the U.S. will have any inclination, positive or negative inclination against or for that. But however, if we talk about technology such as AI or quantum computing, obviously the U.S. will want to make sure that there are no loopholes in terms of the executive administration orders. And that's something that eventually will require them to talk to their partners, including the UK, including Australia. So if there's any potential of companies in these countries also exporting or potentially doing business in China in these areas, I'm sure also the U.S. will be interested in talking to them.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on our program, The Hub on CGTN. Great discussion. We learned a lot. Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Hub. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Bye for now.